Very clearly, one message is the transition is not happening quick enough. So energy demand is growing more quickly than renewable energy uptake. CO2 emissions have risen. And very clearly that there is also continuous investment in fossil fuel and fossil fuel subsidies that is preventing renewable energy to deliver.
The expansion of renewables is booming worldwide. Power capacity additions reached a new benchmark of 536 gigawatts in 2023. But energy demand is still on the rise and is not yet fully met by renewables. Furthermore, renewable energy growth is most noticeable in the power sector, electricity generation, whereas critical energy carriers such as renewable heat and renewable-based fuels remain neglected. As a result, energy-related carbon dioxide emissions rose even further by 1.1% in 2023. So the key question is, what do we need to do to further accelerate the energy transition in general and in the heating and transport sector in particular? We'll find out in this episode. Welcome yet again to our yearly special mini-series of the Smarter E podcast, recorded live here in Munich during the Smarter E conference and exhibition 2024. We made sure to get some of the most interesting international experts and industry representatives and talk to them about the most exciting trends and developments while creating the renewable energy system of the future. Since we're recording this here live at the Smarter E Europe 2024, we have an absolute exclusive opportunity because it just happens that today, while we record this episode, REN21 launched their Renewables 2024 Global Status Report, and none other than Rana Adib, Executive Director of REN21, will tell us all about the key findings. Those of you who do not know REN21, it's basically the renewable energy policy network for the 21st century, bringing together scientists, people from governments, from NGO, and of course from the renewables industry. Welcome, Rana.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Now, Rana, I know the Renewables Global Status Report, it has different modules, I think 5 in total. The third module happens to be energy supply, which I guess is the most interesting here for the Smarter E Europe. What are your key findings in regards to that module?
So I think what is really important when we look at the renewable energy supply is the first message that unfortunately we consume more fossil fuel than ever, which means like there is still a long way to go to phase out fossil fuel and replace it with renewables. The other story is that when we're looking at energy supply again, we look at the supply from heat and from fuels, basically in particular for transportation, and from electricity. And here we clearly see that there are disparities. When we're looking at heat and transport, it's heat and fuels, approximately 80% of the energy we consume. Renewables is actually lagging behind. We have 10% in heat and approximately 3% in fuels. The good story is, and I think that's it's always important to have those stories out and show that we can deliver, is happening in the power sector. When we're looking into the power sector, there is capacity additions in 2023 of 536 gigawatt. It's a record year again. It's a growth of 54% over last year, basically, 2022. And it's very encouraging. It's very much driven by solar photovoltaics and wind. So again, also technology concentration. But what is important here is to mention that when we are coming back to COP28 and the commitments of governments with tripling renewable energy capacities, we look at the capacity that we need to build up every year to be in line with the climate goals. We basically need to double those capacities. And this also means like almost doubling basically the investments going into renewables.
So there's a few challenges ahead. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty details of those, let's give us more like the big picture. What are the other modules? And I think specifically the first two modules are also quite interesting in this context, right?
I think this is basically when you look at REN21 is reporting on the status of renewables since 2005 already. And last year we started to move from one report to 5 modules because the energy transition is actually more complex than only shifting the fuel. It is really about changing the energy system. And when we look at the energy system, it's about energy supply, it's the infrastructure, and it's also about the energy demand. So the sectors like building, industry, agriculture, and transportation that also need to move away from the use of fossil fuel to renewable energy. So That's why we moved basically in this part. There is another component to it too, that renewable energy provide basically economic values and societal values. And in September, we have an upcoming module looking specifically on economic and social value creation. Now, the two modules we have already launched, so basically the global trends module, but also the demand side module is really looking into the overall energy transition, so where we stand here. And the demand side module is really looking into, is electrification happening basically of the energy sectors? Is a shift happening to move to renewables? And what is also the policy trends and challenges ahead?
Now, just in a nutshell, what are the key findings in those first two modules?
In the first one, which is on the global overview, very clearly, one message is the transition is not happening quick enough. So energy demand is growing more quickly than renewable energy uptake. CO2 emissions have risen. And very clearly that there is also continuous investment in fossil fuel and fossil fuel subsidies that is preventing renewable energy to deliver. The other part is also that there is indeed a technological concentration, so solar PV and wind, but also a regional concentration. So we very clearly see, like, obviously China is leading country in the European Union, and in the US there is renewable energy developments. But the reality also is when we're looking into the rest of the world, so Africa, Middle East, Latin America and Asia outside of China, we have 2/3 of the population living basically in countries where only 15% of new installed capacities are happening. So this is for the global overview.
Only 60% of the population get 15% of the growth of renewables.
And also of the investment happening. And this also means very clearly that we need to, the global transition and energy security and energy as a driver for economic development, industrialization, reindustrialization is fundamental, but it's fundamental everywhere in the world. So to make the global transition happen, we really need to ensure that it's happening everywhere.
Now, coming back to what you mentioned earlier, is that renewables are really in the rise when it comes to electrification, but we have a problem in the heat sector, replacing fuels. So why is there so little progress in decarbonisation? Why is it that limited?
So indeed, on the electricity part, there is a real uptake. More than 85% of new installed capacities actually is renewable-based. And this is very clearly a result for long-term and continuous policy attention. With ambitious targets to renewable energy, policy and regulatory frameworks that have led to market development, that have led to technology innovation and cost reduction. So I think the first message and the learning from this is if we have these great records basically in the power sector, we're able to replicate this. But it also means that there needs to be a real policy attention. Now, when we're looking into the heating sector, which is in particular industry and the building sector, but also the transport sector, these are highly dependent on fossil fuel. There has not been policy attention in the past. So 180 countries, as an example, 180 countries have a renewable power target. Only 42 countries have a target on renewable heat. And 3 years ago, it was 20. When we're looking into fuels, we have a bit more than 40 countries that have a biofuel mandate or have targets on electric mobility. And here we clearly see that there is a lag in policy attention. The other aspect is these sectors are highly dependent on fossil fuel consumption, and fossil fuel continues to be highly subsidized. So there is no level playing field actually for renewable energy, in addition to the fact that investing in a heat pump, for instance, is something that also requires upfront costs. And if there is not the right regulatory and policy framework, it's not just going to happen.
And I think subsidies for fossil fuels worldwide are really, it's a crazy high number. I think it's something like 130 billion even. I think there's more subsidies than they actually have earnings in that sector.
Indeed, we've brought it down, and I think the last International Monetary Fund numbers on direct and indirect subsidies, which are for 2022, it's $11 million per minute.
Wow, that is mind-blowing. All the renewables you could build with that money. That's crazy. Now, how could this be changed specifically in the building and transport sector? Is it only about cutting subsidies for fossil fuels, or do we need more incentives?
It's very clear that we need more incentives because we also need to build the markets. And this goes, obviously, it's always the carrot and the stick part. And I think I'll take some examples. Very often, I take the example of transport, for instance. There is, first of all, I think the shift to transport, if we really look into the fact that we need to consume less energy, we need to phase out fossil fuel and move basically to renewables, goes in the transport sector through walking and cycling, it's one word, through public transportation and the electrification, basically. That's when we're looking at road transportation. Why is electrification so important? Here, if we compare an internal combustion engine, so the normal car, to an electric vehicle, we already consume 1/3 of the initial energy. So 2/3 of the energy does not need to be provided. So that's the first part. The other part is very often we hear from some players that they are, it's something for rich people. So I take an example from France. The French government had put in place a social leasing actually for electric vehicles. There has been such a rush basically from a household that have a lower income households. That the government has stopped basically the support, which I think is a real important message. Citizens do understand the opportunities of the transition, but they need to be empowered to really engage here. So these are things that need to happen. So phasing out fossil fuel, using fossil fuel subsidies to shift them to engage basically or allow citizens, industry, the agricultural sector to move in the to participate in the transition. And another part, I take an example of building. There is a possibility to mandate basically energy efficiency standards, renewable energy in the building sector. And globally, I think it's when we're looking at only 60% of new buildings are basically have energy related regulations. So which already show that there is not enough policy engagement.
So it really comes down to reshaping policy, regulations and subsidies, which I guess is a tough nut to crack.
Yes, but I think it's a fundamental parameter because this is also necessary to accompany basically the industrial sector to engage in the shift. I take again the automotive industry, for instance, moving away from the internal combustion engine through a ban that has been decided at the European level by 2035 is sending a very strong signal to the automotive industry that they need to make the shift. And today, actually, it's really interesting to hear industry players are even asking, they say for us, it's important to know in what direction we are going. If we have a fluctuation and we go back and forth, it's actually not helpful to also accompany basically the economic sectors to make the transitions.
I guess in that regard, industry players, specifically in the automotive industry, are even more pro renewables than sometimes the government is. Now, I started out with saying that we have around about 536 gigawatts of renewable power capacity added in 2023, which was a new record. However, I think we would need a total of 1,000 gigawatts added annually to really meet the global climate and sustainability goals. So how can we close that gap? Because that means basically doubling.
The first part is, again, deployment. And I think here it is important to highlight, and this is also one of the findings of the global overview module we had, is that the access to finance is fundamental here. And there is also uneven development across the region. So in OECD countries, we're at capital cost of 4% for solar PV and wind. In developing emerging economies, we're on average at 10%, but this can go up to 20-30% depending on the risk assessment by the finance sector for the country risk in particular. So I think this is one part. The other part too is we know actually that capacities and projects are developed in renewable power, but cannot be connected to the grids or are waiting for permitting. So permitting processes are very, very long. So there's really a focus on accelerating permitting, defining priority zones so that rollout basically of renewable power can happen or renewable capacities can happen more quickly. And the other part is the development and deployment of grid infrastructure. So when, again, coming back to what is the transition, it means shifting the supply. It means shifting basically the use of renewables or shifting the energy use to renewable energy. One of the missing pieces when we look at the power sector in particular is basically the grid infrastructure, storage development, developing of flexibility in the grids. And this also needs to happen so that we can roll out renewable capacities more quickly. Now,
I found a number that I can't quite understand. Maybe you can help me make sense of it. According to the IEA, last year, renewable projects offering at least 3,000 gigawatts of power were waiting for connections to their national grids. That would be 5 times the amount we added last year. How does that add up?
So we looked actually in exactly this number, and a first parameter to mention is like from the 3,000 gigawatt, 1,500 are in advanced stages of projects, so where funding has been cleared, projects have been developed already, might have been built, etc. So I think we have said that it's more honest probably to speak about the 1,500 gigawatt. What does this mean? It means indeed that there is not in my backyard reality that does exist. So there is partly a local mobilization against renewable energy projects, and this is often leading to delays on permitting. There is another part on the permitting process that is very clearly administrative regulated processes that are taking a long time. So again, here, the government and administration has a key role to play basically to accelerate this and facilitate it. And a third part is, however, the fact that the acceleration of renewable electricity and also the electrification of the building sector and transport mean that we need much more electricity in the future. And here, so if you have like a train, high-speed train also requires a rail infrastructure. It's the same when we are looking into the power sector. So it's very clear that we need to develop grids to be able to transfer basically the renewable electricity from the production to the consumption space.
What's interesting with that number is that actually we already would be well on the way to meeting our 1,000 gigawatts a year if we sorted out permitting, if we sorted out citizen acceptance of renewables in their backyard and all the other issues that you mentioned. Now, you ended with hinting towards grid expansion and strengthening. How can we speed up that and also facilitate the financing of these projects? Because I get expanding the grid is something that's just really highly cost expensive.
It's cost expensive. That's very clear. I think maybe also to put things in perspective, you see, like when we're looking into the current. So first of all, the grid is something that needs to be invested in because grid infrastructure is old infrastructure partly. It needs to be renewed. It needs to be expanded. The other part is also, in the past, such infrastructure has been built with public funding. And I think this is also very clearly where public funding needs to occur. When we're looking into basically generation capacities, that's something where you can very clearly mobilize private funding for. When it comes to such infrastructure, it's very clear that there is a responsibility basically from government. How to accelerate it? It's very clearly like, first of all, very clear planning with all players from the energy supply side and the energy demand side. A very clear sector coupling. So when we look at grids, it's also about storage functions, so integrating storage. But storage is not only battery storage, it can also be thermal storage. We see that there are lots of synergies basically when we're coupling the sectors, so electric vehicles, charging infrastructure, batteries here, the heating and cooling supply is an opportunity, demand side management, digitalization, so including and so integrating basically those aspects so that we can already plan for the grid of the future, but also ensure that the investments are really taking into account all the parameters and transition that are going to happen and need to happen. And again, I come back to a part, when it comes to grid infrastructure, it's about integrated planning from the beginning on, but also a very clear citizens' participation, civil society participation to ensure the support basically for such infrastructure development.
So, no small feat to achieve. Let's sum it up like that. Lots to do. It won't be boring in that area for the years to come. Now, let's add another layer of complication to it. And that is, we of course need a 24/7 renewable energy supply. So, knowing how volatile renewables are, specifically also in winter at night, for example, how can we compensate for that?
So we prefer to speak about the variability, and I think this is already one of the reasons why from REN21 side we're really also underlying this technology concentration on solar photovoltaics and wind is actually that these are variable renewable electricities. But when we're looking, they are very well complemented by other renewable energy technologies, whether it is hydropower, where you can also have like a pump storage in addition, whether it is geothermal power, whether it is biomass power also, but also the integration with the heat sector, because thermal storage, for instance, is really the cheapest solution. It can provide long duration storage also in seasons where you basically generate a lot, but you have less of the energy consumption. I think these are elements that are very, very important to provide a 24/7 energy supply, I guess. But when we are speaking about 24/7 energy services, the other part that also comes in is actually what is happening in the energy sector, so on the energy consuming side. Also because they can actually contribute to more flexibility by adopting or adapting their demand to the energy supply, as an example. And what we see here globally is that, unfortunately, only 13 countries really have renewable energy policies for all energy sectors. So that is very clearly one of the policy gaps we identify today. A part of so that there's a lot of renewable energy or policy focus on renewable supply, not enough focus on renewable energy demand. This is one aspect. The other one too is electrification. So we hear very often, and we clearly know electrification is going to happen. Heat pumps, and we have seen it in the energy crisis, the heat pump development in Europe has been fabulous. Electric vehicles have a massive uptake globally. And this means actually it's a really easy way to integrate renewable energy into sectors that are lagging behind policy-wise. So what is, however, important to underline is when we look at the last 10 years, electrification has really happened in China. But when we look, for instance, to US or to Europe, it's basically pretty flat at 22-23%. So another way to ensure 24/7 renewable-based supply and demand clearly means accelerating the electrification of the energy sectors.
Wow. We're really going in depth here. And I even have more questions that will open up completely different chapters. One chapter that I'd like to open up, because you mentioned it earlier already, is that we have 60% of the population only seeing 15% of the growth in renewables, which I guess also has to do with the global financing landscape. So how can we support low-income countries in really benefiting from renewables and maybe leapfrogging right into the renewable era?
So the first part is indeed, and I think that's you need the right policy and regulatory frameworks. That's very clearly a reality. You need access to technologies. So I think this is something to ensure. And very clearly, I think in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis, the energy crisis, we've seen an acceleration of markets basically in China, India, Europe, and the US, and that is also absorbing lots of capacities actually. So which means like ramping up manufacturing capacities is fundamental. But very clearly in developing emerging economies, it is all about access to finance and access to finance under the right conditions. And I think this is where there is a very strong message we're also carrying from REN21 side as a global network into all the policy spaces is from the developing emerging economies actually and market players there. We very clearly need to underline that it's not enough. So capital intensive, renewables is capital intensive. Capital cost is a major barrier. Currency risks are major barriers. And basically concessional loans are not enough to accelerate the transition. Developing countries also need access to grants to really invest in energy infrastructure. I think in this context it's also important to underline here in Europe, we speak very often about the energy security aspect, but energy security, so in developing countries, energy security is actually energy access. And it is energy access, building up an energy infrastructure to provide basic services, but also build up the economy and allow for economic development and industrialization. It's also a question of security in the end.
I guess it's a whole topic in itself that we might dedicate an episode to. But to jump to the last question here, of course, while we record, it's just been 1 or 2 weeks since the European elections, which I guess might change things. We still see the majority with the democratic parties, but there's a big win for right-wing parties who have a totally different view on energy policy. How do you think that might change the energy transition in the years to come?
So do you think that at the European level, the laws have been decided and we don't expect that there will be there is still a larger conservative party bloc that is there. We don't expect that there will be complete revamping of some of the aspects. I think there are potential risks on the internal combustion engine ban. Where it's more critical, I think, is basically the implementation of the European frameworks at the national level, because this is where it needs to be integrated. And this is very clearly where I think from the renewable side, there is very clear messages to have that moving to renewable energy is actually, we don't do it just for fun. We do it because it's necessary, but it actually makes economic sense. And in this context, I really like this example from Uruguay that had very high shares of renewable electricity in their grids already and have as such been resilient to the energy crisis, have been resilient to inflation. So it is also about building resilient economies. Renewables is an opportunity for local jobs, local industry, and I think there is a real narrative where I expect that in the aftermath of the election time, there is real good opportunities to also convince some right-wing governments to move into renewables.
I love that example of Uruguay. I'll certainly look that up, and maybe even we should dedicate an episode to that, because that would really be a prime example. Well, Rana, this has really been a fast-paced ride through so many topics, and I guess we've only scratched the surface also in regards to the REN21 Renewables Global Status Report. Thanks a lot for joining us today. Brilliantly how you seem to have memorized all these details of the report.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Make sure to also check out all the other episodes of our special mini-series recorded live here in Munich during the Smarter E Europe conference and exhibition. And even better, join us for the Smarter E Europe in 2025. More information on thesmartere.de. Looking forward to meeting you.